Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for that incredible speech and that incredible charge. It was both sobering and inspiring as we heard about this tale of two cities. At the same time, I hope that part of also why we came to Atlanta is because it's a great city, and I hope that while you're here, that you make it out of downtown, check out Piedmont Park, go see some of the neighborhoods. It's an exceptional city. All right, so today we're going to talk about democracy, no matter the zip code, and we're talking about that because there are so many threats to democracy across the United States that have taken so many different forms. Right? There is partisan gerrymandering run amok, where political minorities are locking themselves into power, sometimes into power where they have supermajorities in legislatures. In addition, we have situations in which governors are having their powers stripped from them the moment that they get in office if the supermajority political party decides that they don't like the new governor. When it comes to initiative, the initiative process, this opportunity in 24 to 27 states, depending on how you count, to enact legislation that way, there are different threats on that score. In the state of Mississippi, there is the threat that certain issues, including reproductive freedom, would be taken away from the ability to be on the ballot box, for example. So the charge is great. And if Miriam Seifter were here, who unfortunately had to leave, that's why I'm talking more than I otherwise would. But I want to make sure that this gets out there. What our work has shown is that in all 50 states' constitutions, there is a democracy principle. There is a commitment to popular sovereignty. In many states, there's also a free election clause. And so there's this mismatch between what's happening and what's in these state constitutions, and there are opportunities when it comes to state constitutional law to tackle some of these issues as well. All right, just a few actually housekeeping matters before we go a little further. This was probably already probably already true, but this is what I've been instructed to say. Cell phones turned off. When it comes to Twitter or X, tweet away. Hashtag ACS 2024. And in the way of CLE credit, there'll be 2 moments in which I'm going to give you a CLE code. Can I give the first one now? I'm going. Yeah, perfect. The first one is Georgia. Okay. All right, Georgia. All right, so with us today we have an extraordinary panel. So immediately to my left, we have Carrie McNamara, who works as a staff attorney for ACLU Florida. And so there, she's on the front lines of fighting for voting rights. We also have with us Representative Sarah Draper, who is a state rep here in town, and she just won her primary. Yeah. And this is a primary, and she'll probably talk some about this. That is the result. 2 great Democrats, were forced into the same district to run against one another. Another thing about Representative Draper, though, is that in 2020, she also worked on the grounds right here in the state of Georgia with respect to election protection. And we also have with us Bradley Hurd, who works as the deputy legal director for the Southern Poverty Law Center's voting rights practice group, where he leads a dynamic team. I'll also just note that he went to Morehouse, where he graduated magna cum laude, so he has a Georgia connection. Carrie grew up here, and we have a state rep. So this is and I grew up here. I grew up in Athens. This is a very Georgia panel. All right, so each of our speakers is going to talk to us for 5 minutes. I'll ask some questions, there'll be opportunities for the panelists to ask each other questions, and there's going to be a sheet that will go across the room where you'll be, if it's not already, where you can write questions, and those will be collected, and some of those can be asked as well. So let's dig right in here, and I want to begin with Bradley Hurd, because I think you can kind of give us a big picture view of the litigation out there. So what are the challenges that we face, and what are some things that are happening on the ground in the way of litigation to take those challenges on?
Well, thank you. And just interpret 5 liberally, but I'll try not to go too much longer. But you have a mic. Anyway, as anybody who has been paying attention knows, this is a terrible time to be a voting rights lawyer. It's actually a terrible time to be a freedom-loving American. The U.S. Capitol insurrection on January 6th and the ongoing efforts in the intervening years to hold those who were responsible accountable have showed us how fragile our democracy really is to those forces who want to impose authoritarian will on the rest of us. And sadly, we haven't been getting much help from our federal courts in that regard. Fueled by an ahistorical and disingenuous worldview that we've somehow overcome our 400+ year legacy of racism and discrimination, the courts have been working seemingly overtime to water down and whittle away the protections of civil and voting rights laws that have only been in existence for fewer than 60 years. The system of legal segregation in Brown versus Board that supposedly outlawed segregation in 1954 had still not been fully eradicated by 1970 when I was born. And as we all learned last night from our powerful keynote speaker, that was the year that a young Black first grader in Yazoo County, Mississippi, had become part of the first integrated class of public school students in that county. A decade earlier, my mother, who was a native of the neighboring county in Holmes County, Mississippi, was paid by the state to go to Indiana University to complete her master's degree, just so Mississippi could keep its schools white only. And just 3 years ago, my current home state of Maryland finalized a $577 million settlement to end a lawsuit that challenged its unequal funding of programs at historically Black colleges and universities. So I give this context to point out how disingenuous the worldview of the federal courts is. We are not a post-racial society. We are not a nation that guarantees fair and equal representation for people of color, for women, for LGBTQ folks, for homeless folks, for poor folks, and for people with disabilities. We have not overcome, plain and simple. And yet, if you listen to the jurisprudence from our so-called Supreme Court, they're Supreme because they're last, over the past 20 years, you come away with a starkly different impression. So I'd like to start this mini lecture. In 2006, Lulac versus Perry, Chief Justice Roberts, in dissent. It's a sordid business, this divvying us up by race. And then in 2007, in Parents Involved in Community Schools, SCOTUS invalidated voluntary desegregation efforts and said that you could only engage in such efforts if there was a previous de jure policy. You heard about Shelby versus Holder. That'll save at least a minute off of my time. And then you come to 2019, Rucho versus Common Cause. The Supreme Court held that partisan gerrymandering cases were not justiciable in the federal courts. But in so ruling, they ignored the well-known correlation between race and partisanship in this significantly polarized electorate. And it gave states even more incentive than ever to mask their race discrimination by partisanship. And that takes us to a couple of weeks ago, when Justice Upside Down authored Alexander versus South Carolina NAACP, which reversed the three-judge court's ruling that South Carolina's congressional districts were racially gerrymandered, because the court fully credited the legislature's so-called good faith explanation that it was partisanship, not race, that motivated the drawing of their districts. And worse still, they imposed a new burden on plaintiffs to create an illustrative map that actually assists the state in partisan gerrymandering in order to succeed in their claim of racial. You had to be able to establish you can gerrymander partisan gerrymander in a way that doesn't racially discriminate. Just a weird ruling. So where does that leave us as progressive litigators in civil and voting rights cases? What do we do? Well, simply put, we do what we've always done. We have to fight. We don't have the luxury of waiting for a better day, even as we work for that better day. At SPLC, where I work, we've been working to protect democracy across the Deep South, despite hostile legal landscapes. Particularly, the 5th and 11th Circuit are not friendly territories, just in case anybody was unaware of that. But here in Cobb County, Georgia, well, not here, but in Georgia, in Cobb County, we successfully obtained an injunction against the 3rd largest school district in the state, blocking their racial gerrymandering of the school board districts to keep their 4-3 white-black majority. We obtained similar relief in a case that I co-counseled there with Carrie in Jacksonville against the city council and the school districts in that case. We go to trial in Mississippi in August in our Section 2 case in challenging the state's Supreme Court districts, which have not been redistricted since 1987. And they are currently preventing the creation of a majority black district that would have the power to elect 3 of 9 justices in Mississippi. We also, staying in Mississippi, have enjoined state legislation to restrict the ability of blind, disabled, and language impaired people to get assistance from voters, from people of their choice, as they're allowed to under Section 208 of the Voting Rights Act. And as we lead into the 2024 election season, we're carefully monitoring efforts by the rabid right to lodge mass voter challenges in the days and weeks preceding those elections. So we're in a perilous time, but we've been here before. The struggle of progressive warriors, as the Attorney General said, continues. It remains a struggle. And thankfully, with the help of all of you in this room and outside of this room, we will be prepared for the fight. Thank you.
All right, Carrie, in Florida, what are challenges that you see on the democracy front and ways that you're taking it on?
Well, working in Florida, it's almost like there's a law professor whose job it is to come up with every possible constitutional violation like it's an exam. And we at the ACLU of Florida, we have no limit to the type of cases that we could bring because they violate every rule possible. I will flag one of them in specific that has had a huge impact. I don't know if you would have heard about this, but this is a case that we won a few years ago. In 2021, the state of Florida passed a law saying that campaign committees that are raising funds to put a ballot amendment on the, or put a constitutional amendment on the ballot were capped at $3,000 per individual contribution. I mean, I don't know if any of you have followed the law of campaign finance in this country and are aware of who the people are who prevent caps on donations, but it's pretty rich that the Florida government tried to pass that law because it's blatantly unconstitutional. And quite honestly, the way we know it's blatantly unconstitutional is that back in the 1980s, they passed the exact same law, and the Supreme Court, relying on Buckley v. Vallejo in cases even long before Citizens United, struck it down. So they passed this law again. We filed a lawsuit in the Northern District of Florida. We drew a judge who was appointed by the last president, Alan Windsor, who is one of the judges on the Northern District. He was a former Florida Solicitor General. And we said, look, there is binding Supreme Court precedent from the last time Florida tried to do this, and he agreed. And we won a preliminary injunction, we won a summary judgment, and the state didn't even appeal to the 11th Circuit because they were so dead wrong. And you can say, well, why did they bother doing that? Well, from the point that they passed that law in 2021 up until the point at which we got the final judgment in place it was actually happened when I was here at this convention a couple years ago in 2022. They were enforcing this law and preventing anyone from raising more than $3,000 from an individual to get a ballot on the Florida Constitution. Now, I don't know if you were familiar how much it costs to get an amendment on the ballot of the Florida Constitution. We were involved in getting Amendment 4, which is for reproductive freedom. I couldn't give you the exact number, but it's more than $15 million and counting. So you literally can't do that if you've limited the amount there. And we got that struck down, and because of that, that's how we were able to get the Amendment 4 on this year's ballot. And without that, that wouldn't have happened. But during 2022, there were no meaningful ballot initiatives on the statewide ballot. And Ron DeSantis ran for re-election and he ran up the score, and this isn't the only reason he ran up the score. There was quite a lot of unconstitutional and just immoral things that they did to prevent people from voting or to prevent people from even having a reason to vote. But that was one of them, is there were no amendments on the ballot in 2022. The only people to vote for were candidates, and in Florida, there's not a lot of candidates who inspire you to vote. But we won that case, and because of that, we're able to move forward and continue to modify the state constitution. And there are a number of important amendments. There's another ones that were passed back in 2010. You may have heard of them. They're called the Fair Districts Amendments. And those have been in place for 15 years. And in Florida, it is illegal, it is unconstitutional to gerrymander based on partisanship. It's also unconstitutional to gerrymander based on incumbency or to draw potential candidates out of districts before they run. That really cuts off a lot of the avenues that we see in the Alexander case coming out of South Carolina and other places. Now, I wouldn't put it past certain members of the Supreme Court to find a way to explain this, but it seems pretty hard to say that, oh, the good faith of the legislature is that they were actually, without talking about it, violating their own constitution to gerrymander based on partisanship. Now, maybe they were, but they can't say that, and I don't think anyone with a straight face can say that the good faith of the legislature is that they violated their own constitution. And we filed a new racial gerrymandering case in the Southern District of Florida the same day that the Alexander case came out. And we're fortunate that the state legislature specifically talked about how they were using race specifically to draw these districts, which just in a simple terms, they're essentially drawing districts that are quote unquote protected for Hispanics, but they're drawing them so that the white people who are in the Hispanic buckets of Miami are the ones that are being favored in every single district. And all of the Hispanics of color and black Hispanics throughout Miami, of which, Miami is a 70 to 75% Hispanic city and county. And so many people, if you're not I would call a white Hispanic in Miami, you don't have representation. And that's what we're going after. And we are hopefully insulated from or have very strong ability to push back against Alexander because they talked explicitly about how they needed to do this based on race. And they are explicitly prohibited from saying that they did it based on partisanship. And so one of the ways, how do you fight in courts and stay ahead? You have to stay ahead of them. You have to be, they're prepared to prevent the victories of the past from continuing to be the victories of the future. But if we're ahead of them, we keep them scrambling. And I'm sure, we'll win a case and then 5 or 10 years from now, they will have figured out how to beat us. But then we have to be ahead. And we've had quite a bit of success, as Bradley talked about in the city of Jacksonville. We were able to get a final judgment and a settlement to redraw the Jacksonville City Council and school board districts to add more black representation in Jacksonville. That went into place at the end of 2022, just in time for the 2023 municipal elections, in which they elected the first woman mayor of the city of Jacksonville. And the extra district that we drew performed for Rockman Johnson, who is now on the Jacksonville City Commission. And I don't know if, for those of you who know the history of Jacksonville, you can win some trivia. Jacksonville is the largest geographical city in the country. The reason it is because they annexed the entirety of Duval County in order to include all of the white population along the beaches of Jacksonville. I don't know if you are a fan of professional golf. If you ever watched the Players Championship, TPC Sawgrass, that's technically not in the city of Jacksonville, but it's right there in the area of Jacksonville. I mean, many of the professional golfers around the world live in the Jacksonville area. It is a place in which the resources from the city of Jacksonville are sucked out and provided to the very, very wealthy beach suburbs that are majority white. And our work is starting to change that. That's a place that there's a lot more work to be done, but it was really inspiring to see the city go out and organize and perform once we had won that lawsuit that was, Bradley can tell you, it was very hard fought. And we also just finished, we are submitting the settlement to the district court on Monday. We have all of the signatures and it's all been approved, so knock on wood. For the city of Miami, where we did the same thing, where we sued them for racial gerrymandering. They talked about it blatantly and openly that they needed to gerrymander the city commission, and we fought them. We had to go all the way through to trial. We had to, 4 motions to dismiss, 2 or 3 motions to strike. We went all the way up to the Supreme Court on a stay appeal. It was a lot of work, but we're winning throughout the state of Florida right now because we're fighting on the grounds that we can fight. And like I said, there's lots of lawsuits that we can bring, but we find the ones that we can bring. One other thing I just want to say, separate from litigation, because we go to court when we have to, but one other thing that we did, coming out of 2021 with the redistricting process after the 2021 census, we knew people were going to be fighting over the state maps, of the state congressional maps and the federal congressional maps. And we said, let's focus on local municipalities. Our work in Jacksonville and Miami came out of that. But in addition to that, there are a number of counties in North Florida that had 1980 era consent decrees under the VRA to protect black representation. And most of these places hadn't redrawn lines at all since then. And we identified and went to and worked with 9 separate counties in North Florida. I mean, if people know these counties: Jackson County, Madison County, Gulf County, Suwannee County, Calhoun County, Gadsden County, Bradford County, Taylor County, and Franklin County. This is a large swath of the Panhandle and the northern states, or the northern counties of Florida. I mean, it looks like South Georgia. It's the exact same, very beautiful area that is an area that a lot of people have been leaving because there just aren't a lot of jobs. It's very rural. But we went out there and we worked with the individual county commissions, city governments, and said, here's how you can keep complying with the Voting Rights Act. In some situations, we were able to work with them to update consent decrees so that we substituted new class plaintiffs and put them in place and got approvals from the federal courts to keep those things in place to make sure that these counties and these cities have black representation on their governments. And in other places, we were able to tell them, you don't need to make any changes. Keep this the way it is. We won't sue you. You're not vulnerable to a Voting Rights Act lawsuit there. And in all of those places, in these small counties, they don't have the money to go to court. And so they worked with us, the ACLU. And I mean, pretty much all of these are, controlled by people who you wouldn't think would be working with the ACLU. But by going there and working with them in a spirit of cooperation and lining it up, we're able to secure local representation throughout North Florida in a way that I hope to see that blossom and grow over the next decades.
Thank you. Oh, that's really exciting. Extraordinary work. Representative Draper, same question. Right. Challenges you see, ways that you've been tackling them?
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Syra Draper. I'm the state representative for House District 90 in Georgia, which includes the city of Atlanta. And I come at this issue of voting rights and democracy from a couple different perspectives. So I'm a litigator by professional background, and I'm very appreciative of all the wonderful work that is going on right now in the litigation space to protect our rights. But I view litigation as just one of several ways that we can and should protect our democracy. So, I'm in the state legislature. We are a Republican trifecta state. So Republicans control the Senate and the House, and they have the governor's mansion. So that obviously is a limitation as to what kind of policy we can pass with respect to democracy and voting rights. And the assault on democracy and voting rights is alive and well in Georgia, as many of you, of course, know. We've made national headlines. My favorite one was when they went so far, they got so big-headed as to deny food and water to people standing in long lines in Georgia. I mean, that got so much blowback. But that was just one small section of a very, very long bill that was crafted with surgical precision after the 2020 election and after Georgia went blue for the first time in decades. So that was just one provision that cut against voting rights. But every year since 2020, the legislature has been passing these terrible voting rights bills. And I think what's shocking, or maybe not shocking, but look, this is all part of a big systemic effort to overturn these policies that are allowing for victories, democratic victories. We see many of the same pieces of policy that are passing here in Georgia, passing in other states, many southern states. I did have a lot of envy when the Attorney General was talking about pushing back against a lot of these things, because that is not the situation we have here in Georgia. They're inviting all of these kinds of policy changes. But we have by way of example, after 2020, in 2020, I was the voter protection director for the Democratic Party of Georgia and for Biden for president. So have that perspective too of seeing what you can do in the voting rights space with organizing. And organizing as lawyers, right? So the combination of organizing and that legal background is incredibly powerful when we're talking about changing what can happen in voting rights and democracy work. But setting that to the side and getting back to the legislative changes, one of the things after 2020, so let me set the scene. 2020, Georgia turns blue for the first time in a long time, and then we have 2 Senate races in January of 2021 in Georgia, and there's literally nothing else happening in the rest of the country, right? We are the only 2 races in the country, and those 2 Senate races are going to determine who has the majority in the Senate, right? So the world descends on Georgia. And in the weeks leading up to those 2 Senate races, there was a group out of Texas that challenged the eligibility of over 360,000 Georgia voters. They filed these voter challenges. It was completely unprecedented. I mean, we have this law in our books that allows for voter challenges, but in the past, it had really been used as a single kind of voter challenge, like, oh, I know my neighbor moved to Florida, but now I see him in my polling place, I'm gonna challenge his eligibility. And all of a sudden, it's converted into this mass meritless challenge process, and our county election offices, you know, it was the first time we were seeing that kind of thing. We were able, through organizing, through the relationships that we had developed with our county election offices. And by the way, there's 159 counties in Georgia. We have the second highest number of counties only after Texas in the United States. So when we're dealing with our election offices, it's always a mass organizing endeavor to talk to all of them because there's so many. But setting that aside, we had these great relationships with our election offices, and we were able to really stop those challenges before they started by explaining to our boards of elections that they were meritless, that they didn't meet the evidentiary threshold that they needed to meet. We were able to stop the overwhelming majority of those from going forward. There were a few counties in which they did go forward, and there was a lot of confusion in those counties about whether voters had been challenged, whether they could vote, whether they had to vote a provisional ballot, whatever it was. But you could absolutely see the kind of havoc it could have had on that 2021 election had those election challenges gone through. Well, you would think that in a state where all the Republicans say, we care about the integrity of our elections, and we care about confidence in our elections, that they wouldn't want these outsiders interfering with our elections. But what did they do instead? They have passed numerous laws to make those voter challenges, those mass meritless voter challenges, easier to file in Georgia. And what we are going to see now coming up to this 2024 election, we're just waiting for the 90-day NVRA block to expire. We are going to see mass meritless voter challenges, and we are going to, they have made them easier for them to be sustained, so we are going to see them affecting more voters here in Georgia. And just to add icing to the cake, there is a group here in Georgia that has developed a software. It's called Eagle AI. This is crazy stuff. It sounds like the stuff from conspiracy books, but no, it's real. They've developed this software that with a few clicks of a mouse, you can do a mass voter challenge in your county, basically with none of the administrative burden. Like you can just, with a few clicks of a mouse. So we are going to see these mass meritless voter challenges across Georgia coming up with the 2024 election, and our legislature has made it easy. They have rolled out the red carpet for this to happen, because when it comes to voting rights, it only matters if it's helping one party here in Georgia. I mean, they're so transparent about it. And I think that we in the legislature, even though we're in the minority, Democrats are in the minority, one thing we need to be doing all the time is framing these issues in a way that the Republicans don't, because the Republicans are very good about talking about this in terms of, well, we're doing it for election integrity, or we're doing this to bring confidence back to our elections. And, well, why do we have a confidence issue in our elections? Because you guys have questioned the validity of the elections, right? So you caused this problem, and now you're saying to solve this problem, we have to pass all these laws that increase election security when there isn't a security issue in the first place except the one that you've imagined. So it's a really convenient narrative and justification for them to pass these really suppressive new laws. And I'll tell you what, I mean, the average Georgian buys a lot of this, right? Because they have been so good at saying this narrative over and over again. No, we're not suppressing the vote. We need to do this for election integrity. They've been so good at repeating that people really buy it. And in fact, you have a lot of moderates that if you say there's voter suppression in Georgia, they raise their eyebrows. Well, I didn't have a problem voting. I got in and out really fast. So that must be the same for everybody. But that's obviously not the case in Georgia. And it's frustrating to hear people buy into that narrative. And I think, from our position in the legislature on the Democratic side, we have an opportunity to really reframe that issue and talk about this issue over and over again, especially the meritless voter challenge issue is one, it's an opportunity for us to talk about, look at this blatant attempt to suppress the vote. And by the way, it's only happening in Democratic counties, right? They're not, when people say, well, we don't see the voter challenge issue, well, yeah, you don't, because you live in a Republican area. They're not challenging you. So we do have opportunities to talk about these, reframe them, use the press, use, the national press in theory should be interested in what's happening in Georgia and voting rights. So to use that. And then finally, on the organizing side, I don't want to talk all doom and gloom, because, in 2020, we were able to win here in Georgia in spite of voter suppression, right? Because we out-organized it. So we had a very sophisticated apparatus to deal with apparatus, to deal with all these issues as they came, right? And we offered so many support services to voters, from a voter protection hotline to poll watching to a ballot cure operation. Our ballot curing operation, we helped cure over 15,000 ballots, which was more than the Biden margin victory here in Georgia, right? So, yeah. And in fact, the Republicans got really mad about that, started blaming the Secretary of State's office, and the Secretary of State said, hey, only one party had a ballot curing operation, and it wasn't you, so don't blame us. So that was we felt very vindicated. But there are so many opportunities as lawyers to help in voter protection work. And we can talk more about that. I don't know how long I've been going. But litigation is a really, really critical tool, and having that at your disposal, and certainly having that as a threat, is awesome. But when you are in the throes of an election, sometimes litigation isn't the best tool because it's not fast enough, right? And you know what, I'll stop there. I have a lot of other thoughts on the redistricting stuff and why litigation is too slow to deal with redistricting, especially in light of Shelby, but I'll let you lead this conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, actually, part of how you left off is a perfect bridge to what I was going to ask next. So, I mean, in this room, we have extraordinarily talented lawyers and law students who will be extraordinarily talented lawyers. We have professors. I see a dean. So, we've heard some of the things that y'all have been doing to fight back. What are things that people in this room can do to save our democracy? In any order.
One thing I will say that you could do if you know anybody in Florida, tell them to go on their local county supervisor of elections website, look up their voter registration, and request a mail ballot. It used to be that you could just say, I want mail ballots, and they'll send them to you. Florida is very good about allowing you to vote by mail. They're not good about giving you places to drop them off, but you can mail them in. However, a couple years ago, they passed a law that said after every 2-year election cycle, all requests for mail ballots are erased. And so you have to go back and ask again. And so I, for example, in like December of 2022, I went on and immediately said, yes, send me mail ballots. And every so often I go and check with the Miami-Dade Supervisor of Elections website that I still have my request to get a mail ballot. But you may be seeing these statistics pop up. I see them pop up on Instagram, partly because I'm in Florida and I follow all these things. But at this point of 2020 election cycle in Miami-Dade County, there were like 650,000 requests for mail ballots in place. Currently, there's about 125,000. I mean, it's just massive. And it's a lot of people, they realize it's time to vote when the ballot comes in the mail. And so if you know anyone who lives anywhere in Florida, remind them. All you gotta do is click a few things, call your county. It varies county to county, but go and find out. There's a lot of infrastructure in place, and they'll defend it at the state level saying, look, if you wanna vote, all you gotta do is click a few buttons and you can do it. We make it easy. We just make you do it over and over again because that's the only way that they can win. They could win partisan elections in Florida without too much trouble, but in order to get reproductive freedom enshrined in the Florida Constitution this fall, we have to get 60% of the voters in the state to approve it. Unlike in Ohio, where they fought and prevented the 60% threshold from being imposed, and Ohio's amendment got about 59%, and maybe they would have got 60 if they needed to, but thankfully we didn't need to find out. In Florida, we have to get there, and so those margins are very important. Even if the presidential election or the congressional elections in Florida aren't that close, Amendment 4 will be that close. And every single person needs to vote, and they need to have the opportunity, and they need to go and click those buttons and do it. So if you know anyone, let them know. That is one way to make sure that people are voting.
Thank you for that.
I would say one of the things that a lot of folks in this room could do, this room, the statistics are probably a little less skewed this way, but I imagine that some small portion of you all will go, once you graduate, to big law, and will not immediately go and hop in and save the world. And that is perfectly fine. Law school debt is real. Family obligations are real. I spent time in big law. I think Carrie did as well. I spent time in big law right here in Atlanta. So one thing that you can do when you get to big law, and as you are looking for opportunities, pro bono opportunities, our organizations are, even organizations like SPLC, which is fairly well staffed, it's not enough. I mean, particularly in these days. So the work that you could do for pro bono through your law firm, it's a great way not only to help out voting rights organizations, but it's a great way to get hands-on litigation experience earlier than you otherwise would likely.
Nice. Thanks. Representative Draper?
Yeah, so 2 pieces of advice. One, very practical. Vote early and encourage everyone you know to vote early. There's a couple different reasons for that. One, if you do have any problems at the polls, you have time to resolve it before Election Day. And that's the same for anybody else that you tell to vote early. So do that. But also from a campaign perspective, if you're interested in the politics side of it, once you vote, you come off the lists that the campaigns are using to get out the vote, right? So they're spending a lot of money and a lot of effort to get people to vote who may or may not vote. So if you know you're gonna vote, do it early, get off that list, and then they can concentrate on getting out the people who may or may not vote. So that's number 1. And then number 2, for the overachievers in the room, well, let me ask this. How many of you have poll watched before? Okay, that's a super healthy number. There are so many opportunities within the voter protection space to get involved. And some of it is election day, some of it is during early vote, but for instance, in Georgia, where we had a hotline to help people, we started, months out because problems started with registration, right, during the registration phase. So it doesn't have to be lawyers, but having a legal background and being able to read the code and understand the statutes is really helpful when we're trying to navigate these issues that voters call with and they come up with every single issue. So get involved with voter protection. They have it on the soft side as well, but I'm a big fan of the hard side. Your state Democratic Party should have a voter protection program if you want to get involved, so contact them. And if they don't, come to Georgia, because we had over 12,000 volunteers in our voter protection team in 2020. And we're gonna need every one of those and more. And a lot of it is remote. In fact, some of them are in this room right now. So if you don't want to go to your state, come to Georgia, we'll use you.
That's a good reminder, actually. In addition to being a poll watcher, some of you can volunteer to be poll workers, because if you spend time, so in my prior life, I worked for 12 years at Department of Justice in the voting section, and we would go monitor elections in various places. And you get to see, there are a lot of our senior warriors who are staffing polling locations all around this country. They do a phenomenal job, but they could use a little help from some newer soldiers. It's an amazing experience. It's very fulfilling, and you also get to kind of witness firsthand, as I did when I was monitoring elections, you witness firsthand how very subtle things that can happen in a polling place can result in, a very smoothly running polling place and a polling place with a line out the door and down the escalator. It just could be, one tweak could change that. So,
just a fun fact. I'm gonna poll the audience here. Prior to COVID, can anybody guess? Just yell it out. What the average age of a poll worker was in Georgia?
60.
think it was 78. Yeah, so COVID, we got some new people coming through after COVID. But yes, we could definitely use a lot of new folks. And a lot of that work is very physical. You're dealing with heavy election equipment and such, so poll working is a great idea.
12-hour days, like,
Yeah,
come on.
at least.
Wow. All right, so I don't have any questions from the audience just yet, so I'm going to ask another question, but as soon as I get any of those, I will certainly ask them. They are encouraged and welcome. But I would like to ask about state constitutional theories, because I think people are probably more familiar with Voting Rights Act theories and with 14th Amendment type theories. Are there ways that you've seen state constitutional law play a role, whether it be free franchise provisions or home rule? Like, are there things that you've seen that might be inspiring and might inform people about theories that we don't tend to learn in at least our federal common law classes?
Just off the top, I mean, I think, there's several states, probably none in the Deep South, but several states. Well, actually, Florida's got, Florida's got actually a fairly good state laws governing voting. The problem is they have a very bad state Supreme Court interpreting them. But in a lot of states, there are enhanced protections. For some states, for instance, prohibit, as does Florida, they prohibit partisan gerrymandering. Some states have a stronger interpretation of protections for the right to vote. Some states allow people with felony convictions to have immediate restoration of their right to vote. Some very smaller states, you can vote while you are serving your time and while you're serving your sentence. So sometimes you do find kind of interesting theories of relief that you wouldn't have federally in state laws or state constitutions.
Thank you. All right, so we have a question. So often in the North, people write off the South because they blame the South for their own issues by voting the way they do. With discussions on voter suppression, gerrymandering, and misinformation and disinformation, what are some ways that Northern-based allies can help ensure voting rights in the South?
Write us off at your peril. First of all, you can take the U.S. Senate in 2020 to Georgia, so. Look, I mean, I kind of talked about this a little bit, but we need allies, right? If you live in a state where this isn't an issue, we welcome you to help us in our work because there's going to be a lot of work. But I think with that, the tone of that question struck me because we're the cradle of the civil rights movement here. Like, a lot of the protections that have come from the United States have come from the long work that has happened in the South. And so, the fact.
I had to utter those words.
I mean, well, the snark in me says, look in a mirror before you start throwing stones at the South. But anybody ever tried to look at electoral politics in New York State? I mean,
I will say, I've lived and voted in 5 different states, and the only state that ever prevented me from voting in 2010 was New York, because I moved there too close to the election. That's the only election I've missed in my life in New York.
Sorry.
And I will say, just, I hear a lot of people say, oh, what if we took a saw and just carved Florida off and let it sink into the ocean, which it might happen anyway. Wouldn't that be better? And I will tell you this, anything that's happening in Florida is happening where you live too. You might not know about it yet, but you will. Florida is not some aberration. We have everything there. And people from every other state in the country come to Florida. So pay attention to what's going on in Florida, because it's gonna come to your state. It already is there, and you're gonna find out about it when it's too late. And for that matter, everybody has family that lives in Florida because someone has retired or come down or whatnot. Talk to them. Make sure they're registered to vote. Make sure they've requested their ballot. Make sure they know what protections they have, and have them talk to their friends And if you want to volunteer, come down and do poll watching in Florida. Come down and, you know, help repair after there's a hurricane or whatnot, because, you know, there is going to be storms affecting parts of the state every year. We don't know where it is. In 2022, hurricane went through and hit Lee County and Fort Myers in the southwestern part of the state, and they had to scramble and reassemble and let people vote anywhere within the county because polling places were shut down. And so there's plenty of opportunities to come down and help volunteer. It doesn't have to be voting specific, but just come down and get involved and learn what's going on, because we're just as much a part of the country as you are.
And I think there's a little lesson in this too, because, you know, if you do come down, we want you to come down, but also let the people on the ground lead, the ones that have been doing this work for a very long time and have the relationships. I mean, I know after 2020, when we had all these folks come down in their suits from DC and New York, you know, these election offices across Georgia are saying, well, bless your heart. Right? So you need to let the people on the ground who have these relationships and have built trust over time lead those battles. And so we absolutely want your support, but not your indignation.
Bless your heart never means bless. Trust.
Polite way to say something else.
Okay. So it's time for our next CLE code. This couldn't be more perfect. It's South. All right, our next question is, what would a federal statutory ban on partisan gerrymandering look like? And is there any path to that at the federal level post-Rucho?
I mean, the federal Supreme Court has said that it's a non-justiciable political question, which literally means go to Congress to solve this problem. It doesn't mean it can't be solved. It means the court has removed themselves from it. I mean, in Florida, we have it enshrined in our Florida Constitution. You cannot gerrymander on the basis of partisanship. Every single state, you can go and get that into your constitution, and then that cuts off the nonsense about, oh, partisan gerrymandering is a way to turn a blind eye to racial gerrymandering. And you could do it at the federal level too. I mean, it's possible that they would say, oh, this doesn't fit under like a 14th Amendment power, other powers for Congress to do it, but let's try. It's absolutely something that could be done and needs to be pursued, because partisan gerrymandering is a problem. It is how we get where we are, and we can fight back against it. And just because the Supreme Court says they're not going to do anything about it, it's like, well, we could do a lot more than they will, because we've seen what they do when they try to fix a problem.
All right, this next question, I hesitate to ask it, but I have three, and so here we go. All right, Eagle AI for liberal counties. What about similar tools for conservative counties? Mm-hmm. Seems like the folks who point the fingers are often guilty of what they're accusing someone else of doing. Any thoughts on that?
So mass voter challenges in Republican counties?
In the places where there's not.
Look, as someone that believes in democracy and voting rights as a principle, and it should apply to everyone no matter what your partisanship, I will never advocate for using a tool of voter suppression, no matter against whom. All right. I like that answer, I like that. But as a practical matter, I mean, just the way that Georgia's set up, it is a lot easier to cause chaos in Democratic-rich areas, because Democratic-rich areas tend to be more densely populated, have more populations that move around more, so you have changes in voter registrations. So it's very difficult to have the same kind of havoc effect in rural Republican areas that someone can more easily have in the Democratic areas. So I don't think it's apples to apples at all. But yeah, principle, I'm against it.
Nice. I felt like Steve Harvey. Good answer, good answer. Are there any other questions in the audience? Oh, thank you. All right, perfect. What opportunities do you see to potentially use the Shelby County decision against the court? The Shelby court said that no racial division exists, data was outdated, et cetera. But since the transparent fallout of that decision, is the data now stacked against that holding?
Well, I mean, a couple things that we've done. In addition, the Florida constitutional amendment that bans partisan gerrymandering, it also implements Section 5 and bans retrogression and breaking down of districts. It doesn't rely on any federal formulas. You can do that at the state level too, and passing state level VRAs and state level modified and improved versions of the VRA, it's essential. Get it out there. We got a state VRA introduced in the Florida legislature this year, and every single Democrat in the legislature sponsored it, which never happens. Of course, that's all that happened because it's a supermajority control, but you got to start somewhere and you got to keep doing it. And anytime a big piece of legislation passes, people will talk about how many years it was proposed and reproposed and eventually it passed. You got to start now. And second thing I will say is that one of the reasons that we continue to have success under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act and related constitutional racial gerrymandering claims that rely on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is that in order to prove a claim of vote dilution or a claim of racial gerrymandering using Section 2, you have to go and get experts to analyze the type of voting and the numbers and what the racial breakdowns are in recent elections in that jurisdiction. So instead of relying on Congress to come up with numbers to tell us where to go, we're doing that in every single case. Now, of course, the Supreme Court might just say that all the experts were full of nonsense and just spend an entire 10 pages of an opinion that Clarence Thomas wouldn't even join because he thought this is a little bit too much. But you could still do that, and I do think, we'll see, but that is the number one argument against why Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act needs to be sunsetted as well, because it's not relying on old data. It's relying on the most recent elections in the jurisdiction. And as long as we keep doing that, that is a way to keep the protections in place and going forward. Now, at the same time, let's get Congress to pass some new, reinvigorate Section 4 and Section 5 and create new numbers. And there's plenty of evidence since Shelby County of places in this country that, not based on what they were doing in 1965, what they're doing in 2025 or 2020 or 2015. There's a lot of evidence of a lot of places suppressing the vote in recent years. And all it takes is a Congress that will do it to pass some laws to reinvigorate Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act.
Can I touch on, we had a voting rights violation in Georgia on our maps that we passed in 2021, and we saw that process play out in litigation in federal courts here in Georgia. So the maps that we passed, our state legislative maps and our congressional maps, were deemed to violate the Voting Rights Act. And there was a very lengthy trial where they eventually said, yes, there was a violation, and they called a special session so that we had to redraw the maps. That happened in December of this year. And what was so frustrating about that entire process was it took well over a year to get to the determination that a violation of the Voting Rights Act had occurred. Then the legislature passed a new set of maps, and the plaintiffs went back to the court and said, hey, this new set of maps also violates the Voting Rights Act. And what the judge eventually kind of said was, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but we're about to have elections in 2024, and it took me 14 months to get to the initial determination that there was a Voting Act violation. So I can't go through that same fact-intensive, specific inquiry to determine whether this new set of maps also violates the Voting Rights Act. So we're going to leave it as it is for now. And seeing that play out was so frustrating, right? Because basically we ran out of time. And so that is just something that we are up against now, and will continue to be up against. And it just leaves a lot of uncertainty because as Georgians, that case is still pending. We are now having an entire election cycle under this new set of maps. It is possible that the court comes back and says the new set of maps are illegal, and we'll do the next election cycle under a different set of maps. And that's a whole other form of voter suppression, right? Because when the districts keep changing and the lines keep changing and people have to change their registration, whatever it is, go to different precincts, whatever, it causes mass confusion. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you. This is actually, that's very closely related to one of the questions here. And I'm told we're going to go a little bit over based on that last card that I had. So this person just wants to hear more about the redistricting process in states that are engaging in these kinds of practices. So what are some concrete things that they're doing in order to kind of rig themselves into power?
drawing Democratic incumbents into the same district so that they have to duke it out in the primary?
I mean, yeah, I mean, and I live in Maryland, and the opposite is true there. I mean, Maryland is one of the most gerrymandered states in the union, but it's blue Maryland, and so a lot of the gerrymandering in that state happens. I'm definitely not both sidesing this, but I'm saying that political gerrymandering is a tool that, you know, Congress needs to address, particularly since the court has washed its hands of it. It's you know, and the way that that's going to happen is to get voting majorities in Congress and a president who will sign it. I mean, that's the practical solution to get some reform in the partisan or political gerrymandering. But the other thing I would say about redistricting, and something that we have witnessed this election cycle that has not really been possible in previous election cycles, and we at SPLC have kind of worked with community groups as well, but there are tools now that bring the redistricting process closer to the public. Sites like, if you want to nerd out, just go to Days Redistricting, and you can draw districts, and so having the public, you know, participate in developing maps and weighing in on maps and educating the public with regard to the redistricting process is very helpful when it comes to redistricting. I mean, it's politicians still draw the lines, but politicians are political beings, and if they are sitting in front of numbers of people who are saying, why not this map? Why not that map? You know, that might also be a way to help influence in future cycles.
Yeah, absolutely. Go and get an account on Days Redistricting and go and mess around. You could do it in your local city council. You could do it all the way across the state. And in many states, like in Florida, you can submit your proposed maps to the legislature and it's in the record. There's a website, FloridaRedistricting.com, I think is what it's called. You can find it. It's run by the Florida legislature, where you can go and look at citizen proposed maps from various cycles. And when we file a lawsuit, we can include those maps in our lawsuit and point and say, you had these in front of you at the time you chose to instead pass the map that you did.
Next question is, what's the best method to illustrate the importance of demolishing partisan and racial gerrymanders to people who are not prioritizing that in the fight? So what do you say to what do you say to somebody who says, I'm worried about this issue and that issue and this issue, I'm not so much worried about the issue that we're talking about in the way of democracy?
I think it's tough because it's such a kind of nerdy issue. I mean, I know that one of the things they did in Georgia was they released the maps at the last possible moment, right? Purposely so as not to engage the public. The public didn't have enough time to look at the maps, and then they passed the things very quickly, so there wasn't a lot of scrutiny. And so when these things are, you know, it's a kind of complicated, nerdy issue, you need software or at least computer access to figure out what's going on, and then even if you get your account on Days Redistricting, I mean, there's very few people who specialize in this, right? Very few people, because it's a niche area. So when it's just, people can barely focus on a news headline these days, right? They have to be really gimmicky to get people to read the article. So when you get these issues like redistricting and drawing maps and demographics and, you know, racial breakdowns and whatever else, most people are not going to be able to follow it. And I think a tactic of the right is to make it so that people can't easily follow it. So I'm giving you a lot of reasons why it's hard to engage folks. I'm not really answering your question, but it is also the foundational piece to all policy, right? It is the foundational piece to all policy, and I think people do fundamentally understand that. I think where we have these independent redistricting commissions in states, I think overwhelmingly it's because it's been a citizen-led issue that has been put on a ballot, right? These state legislatures are not willingly giving away their power. It's the people demanding it. And so I think that's a good indication that there are folks that understand the importance of this. Now, in many southern states, it is very difficult to get an issue, a referendum on the ballot, right? In Georgia, it would be almost impossible for us to get an independent redistricting commission via referendum on the ballot because of the way it's set up. So I think there's lots of pushes for that. I think when we see it in other states, people start inquiring, well, why can't we do it a different way? And we just need to continue to talk about it and the importance of it.
One thing I can say that would make a big impact on congressional redistricting and the ability to have more representative government, let's increase the size of Congress. Add seats. I mean, there should not be, 700,000 people or something per district. There should be a lot fewer. We could easily have 1,000 members of Congress. And that would make it, there would be a lot more representation.
So my last question, this is for each of you, it's a two-part. So part of it is a question that came from the audience and part is one I want to ask. So the two-part question is, how do you stay joyful and hopeful? And my question is, who is a hero of yours in this fight and why?
Well, I try to be an optimist. I try to stay joyful. Events like this actually help to keep yourself joyful because working out in it can be, very depressing when you're out here getting motions to dismiss granted, getting, judges who are looking at you askance, having, people who are not, pleading with voters to care and to worry about it, but they're so disenchanted with the process that they're not really participating. So events like this, I think somebody said yesterday, like Judge Reeves' speech was a power pill. I think you need those every now and again to keep you grounded. What was the second?
A hero of yours in the fight and why?
A hero of mine, I'll choose a local one. So I got started in voting rights here in Georgia, working with a community group. And I'm in a fraternity, Alphas, if anybody wants to know. But we did voter registration work. We ended up having to sue the state of Georgia, which is how I got involved in voting rights because I brought the lawsuit. And a woman by the name, everybody knows her now, by the name of Helen Butler, with the Georgia Coalition for the People's Agenda. I always tease Helen because I say, well, you're everybody's client now, but you were my client first. Georgia Coalition for People's Agenda was my client first, but having people like Helen Butler, she is a force of nature, and just gives you reason to go on.
Thank you.
Those two are related for me because this work is so, it can get you down, but the coalition of people that I have met through doing this work are some of the best humans that I have ever met, and I know that will continue. And when I think about how hard this work is, I think of my personal hero, who I had the great privilege of being represented by, Congressman John Lewis. And I've been doing this for a blink of an eye compared to the time that he spent fighting these battles. So when I think about it being tough, I just think about him and how long he did it and what a difference he made, and it gives me the power to go on.
Yes, I will echo that. I was fortunate I lived in John Lewis's district back 20 years ago now, and I had the good fortune of being able to vote for him in both 2004 and 2006, and it's hard to feel more pride than being able to go out and cast that vote. But another hero of mine is a woman who's now Judge Nancy Abudu, who is a member of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. Some years ago, she was at the Southern Poverty Law Center, but before that, she was the legal director of the ACLU of Florida. I never worked directly with her, but many of the people I work with work directly with her, and there's not a better human being on earth. And we are so proud to have her on the 11th Circuit. I mean, we need a lot of help there. You know, let's get 10 more of her and put her on the court, and then maybe we'll go back to the era. One of the things, if you work in voting rights in this space, you actually cite quite a few cases from the Fifth Circuit back when we were in the Fifth Circuit before they split it up, from the 70s and 80s. And the Fifth Circuit ain't like that anymore. But it can be again, and the 11th Circuit can be that way again. Look at the Fourth Circuit. When I was in law school 15 years ago, the Fourth Circuit was not a place that we thought we would ever win cases. And now it's the bulwark that is fighting back against some of these more conservative circuits. So if you think something can't change, yes, it can. It takes time, but guess what? We all got time.
Perfect, thank you. Well, on that hopeful note, thank you so much to our fabulous panelists and to our great audience.
You're very close to happy hour now.
Yeah.
Please welcome to the stage ACS President Russ Feingold.
Well, thank you, Professor Smith, and to all the panelists for that wonderful discussion, closing out the substantive portion of the event today. Thank you, Attorney General Platkin. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to you, your courage in New Jersey, and your broader observations. We're very fortunate to have you here for such a key speech. And thank you to all our incredible speakers and panelists. You know, sometimes people say to me, well, what does ACS really do? Don't you really just have kind of convenings where you try to figure out what to do about the Federalist Society? Well, what is your impact? Well, of course, that disregards some of the amazing things we do, such as already having 201 lifetime judges in under the Biden administration, and already recruiting last time 300 poll workers. This time we're going to do 500. That's impact. But I'll tell you, what I heard today at this convening was impact. For me, at my age, to sit here and listen to these wonderful people all day whose careers are dreams of inspiration, you better believe that has an impact. That changes almost all of your lives, I bet, in some way. It can lead you to a path where you will end up here telling us about the great stuff you're doing. That's impact. And so I really am grateful to have been a part of this conference. So I want to thank all of you for joining us for our 2024 ACS National Convention here in Atlanta, Georgia. It's been a wonderful few days, and I've enjoyed so much also speaking to so many of you individually. You are the leaders. You truly are the leaders of the progressive legal community in your schools, in your cities and states, and throughout the nation. The energy and engagement that ACS members like you bring to your communities has obviously never been more crucial. As so many of the conversations we've had over the last 2 days make clear, we are dedicated to supporting, lifting up, and being partners in the important work of pursuing justice everywhere and securing constitutional rights in every community. This is, as the panelists were just pointing out, very challenging work, no doubt about it. But it's why I'm so grateful to be working alongside each and every one of you. Together, we are working to reimagine and reform our laws and legal institutions to protect the rule of law, to advance equality, and strengthen the foundations of a multiracial democracy at the federal, state, and local levels. Together, we can seek to achieve justice everywhere and secure constitutional rights in every community. So I obviously urge you to remain engaged in this effort. Go to our website, acslaw.org, to find out more about your local student and lawyer chapters and how you can support our work. Our network is the heart and soul of ACS. Finally, I want to especially thank our board of directors and our incredible sponsors, and especially the staff who put together this fantastic program. Great job.